Andrea, we are standing in, I guess the new exhibit is behind us here at the museum. And tell us the name of the exhibit and I guess what it is that it represents.
Mm-hmm. The exhibit is the Rusländer, and it represents the migration in the 1920s of Mennonites that fled the Soviet Union and came to Canada. There was about 24,000 of those migrants who came at that point between 1923 and then when the opportunity kind of shut down in 1930.
Can you tell us where the idea came from to have this as the next exhibit for 2019?
Well, the assistant curator here at MHV, Jenna Clausen, she's actually writing her master's thesis on our collection. And this is work she started as a master's student, just a researcher here at the museum, before she became employed here. And so her thesis is about studying the 500 or 600 Rusländer objects that we have, things that people brought from the Soviet Union to Canada with them, and what do those things symbolize and what do they mean for us today? How do we remember the Rusländer migration?
There are a few artifacts here that immediately catch the eye, and right off the bat, you notice the introductory panel as you walk into the gallery here. Where does that photo come from? What does that photo represent?
Right. Well, the photo comes from the Mennonite Library and Archives in Kansas, but the photo is taken of one of those groups of Rusländer Mennonites. Just after they crossed the Soviet border, you had to switch trains from a Soviet train, in this case, to a Latvian train. So that photograph is taken at the train station in Riga. And the information that we have about it is that they stopped for an impromptu worship service and that they sang one particular hymn in German, Nun danket alle Gott, which is Now We All Thank Our God. And so our introductory panel has Rusländer in very bold letters that I hope strikes people as a little bit incongruous with the image and gets their attention. But then we also have some English translations of lines from that German hymn. And so when you look at that photograph, for me that sort of undercuts maybe the image that people often think of with the Rusländer. They often think of high culture and fanciness and wealth. But here you have people escaping a very difficult situation, and now they finally come into freedom. And what kind of a release is that to them? So you see this photograph, and what strikes me is, because we could blow it up so big, it's almost life-size. And you see everybody the men have their hats removed. All of the women in the photograph have their hands up to their faces, or there's handkerchiefs, and they're crying. And so I know when the installers came here, you'd think I would be immune to this because we've been working on this for a year, but I almost cried when I saw that, because it's just this one moment of escape into freedom, and what does that mean for people? When we think of history, we know how things turned out, but they didn't. They were living it, right? You don't know what the unknown is ahead. And so it's just this very gripping image that sums up what this experience must have felt like.
Then as you walk further into the gallery, you see the ransacked kitchen. And talk a bit about that. You mentioned earlier that that was maybe one of the highlights of putting this exhibit together.
That's true. When we thought about this exhibit, we thought, what's a visual thing that will grab people's attention? And you hear these stories of the anarchists going through Mennonite and non-Mennonite, but in this case we're talking Mennonites, going through homes and just completely ransacking the place. There was violence involved, property damage, theft, violence to people, property. How do you put that into an image that might stop people and get them to think? So we thought, well, a kitchen. And initially we thought there's also stories of people kind of escaping in the middle of the night, but they're escaping secretly, but so needing to make their place look like they were going to come back. So coffee is left on the table, the dog is at the door. And these really do grip your attention, but how do you convey a hastily left house that looks like they're coming back? So about halfway through the exhibit install, we said, I don't think that that's feasible for us to expect people to understand that at a quick glance. Let's make it look like somebody, like anarchists, came in and trashed the place. So that was a very fun project for us, because generally we were careful with the ransacking, but generally we're not creating mess, we're organizing and creating order. And in this case, it was the exact opposite, which was quite a bit of fun.
Just curious, why the decision? I know that I've seen photos, and I know that before you ransacked it, though, you had a perfectly placed, a perfectly looking kitchen. Why that decision?
Well, two reasons. Partly it was for the fun of it, but partly also to plan out when an actual room is ransacked, if you throw something, it would have a relationship to where it was originally in the room, right? So to put things in perfect place was partly for that. What's the trajectory of when you throw a cloth napkin out of a closet? Where might it go? And if you knock a plant off of a table, where would it fall? So it's kind of figuring, I've never ransacked a room before, so it's trying to figure those things out. So partly it was fun having a very distinct before and after, but also partly to figure out what would happen, if a drawer was ripped open and cutlery was thrown out of it.
Behind you is this beautiful dress. Can you describe it to us, or explain what this dress represents? I guess who does it belong to?
Mm-hmm. It belonged to a woman called Maria Hayes. She immigrated to Canada in 1924, and the dress kind of represents it's kind of 1 foot in the area of the exhibit where we talk about why Mennonites left, and 1 foot in the area where we talk about the conditions in which they arrived and how they settled in Canada. So the dress has 1 foot in both worlds. The world that Maria Hayes and her family had in the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union was one of privilege. They were part of the social elite. They had a flour mill, so they were wealthy merchants. They had running water, maids, electricity, and they lived that kind of a life. So we have photographs of her, one in particular of her wearing the dress at her sister's wedding, and they were part of the social elite. So what happens to that family is sort of an example of what happened to a lot of Mennonites in that kind of violent turmoil that followed the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And in her case, her husband died of typhus in 1920. The two eldest sons enlisted in the White Army during the Civil War that followed the revolution. One was eventually exiled to Siberia, and I think the other one made it to Canada, but quite a ways after the rest of the family. So she was left with the two youngest children, and they then fled. They were held in Germany for a while, and then they came to Canada here. And they ended up settling in a log house in Grenthal. They had the means to buy a farm, but we have pictures of this log house as well. And so for me, whenever I look at that dress, you think, you go from this to this, and the logistics of having a dress that is that fancy and that delicate. It's made of lace and silk, and it has whalebone stays. I mean, it's made for a completely different life than what she would have lived on this farm in Grenthal.
Andrea, are there any other artifacts here that you want to highlight, or ones that stand out, or maybe are particularly special to this exhibit?
Mm-hmm. I think some of the bigger pieces in the exhibit, often you think of anchor pieces for an exhibit, and so the dress is obviously one, the kitchen scene is another, the child's bed here is another one, and the piano behind me. So those are kind of the anchor pieces to the exhibit, and part of the framework on which we hang the rest of this story. And in many cases, the child's bed has a similar sort of symbolism as the dress. How do you carry a 6-foot-long, heavy, it is heavy, we've carried it, metal bed when you're fleeing in a boxcar, and there's very little that you can take with you? How do you make those decisions about what to take and what not to? And in most cases in this exhibit, we've featured artifacts that were actually brought along by people. So what influences that choice? Do you bring practical things for getting up and getting started and kitchen utensils? Or do you bring things that remind you of home and speak of those memories of family and, before life fell apart, essentially? So for me, those are the gripping pieces in the exhibit.
If you had one wish for this exhibit, or somebody who walks through this exhibit, and what it is that you hope they really take home, do you know what that would be?
Yes. When we think about the Rösländer story, and I think often just generally Mennonite history here, our mission here is to tell people about Russian descendant Mennonites and their history. When we talk about that, we often are just talking about ourselves. And what I want for people to see in this exhibit is to get a different sense of that history, to understand what objects mean, and the weighty kind of symbolism that they have in our lives today with how we remember the past. But I also hope that it will kind of be a tool that helps them look outward. So we've partnered with Eastman Immigrant Services on one specific case right at the front of the exhibit to try to tell the story that, yes, there are elements of this that are unique to Mennonites, and this is a part of our history that is difficult and that we need to remember and learn from and take things away from. But this should also be something that connects us to other people. Steinbach has a lot of immigrants coming to live here, people who have no connection to a Mennonite past. So how, as a museum, how can we create community, and how can we link people together? We do that by telling Mennonite stories, but also by inviting other people in and by connecting, having people look outwards rather than just focus on our own stories. What do those stories mean? How do they influence how we carry ourselves in the world today?
What are some of those pieces that have been donated or that have been offered to this exhibit from Eastman Immigrant Services?
We have a case at the front, and so we partnered with their communications workshop, and there were 5 participants, and all newcomers to Steinbach within 2 or 3 years. And we asked them, what's an object that sums up your experience of why did you leave your homeland? Why did you come to Steinbach? What was that like? 4 of them submitted objects, and the 5th one said, well, what if we don't have an object? And I thought initially, well, everybody has something. But it turns out that person in particular had been a refugee from Syria who fled with nothing. And so you think that already hits home when you just take it for granted that newcomers can bring things along. Not everybody can. So we have photographs actually of his journey from Syria to Steinbach. He submitted a bunch of photographs, and again, there are a few things about this exhibit that almost bring me to tears every time I think about them, but that story in particular, just these photographs documenting his fleeing Syria and finally being reunited with his family here. There's a photograph of them at the Winnipeg airport after they haven't seen him in 5.5 years. He was 17 when he left. His brother didn't know who he was because he was so young, and you have them like this moment of reuniting. The other objects in that exhibit are objects that talk about what it's like to leave. Another participant said, when I left home, I didn't think I would meet those people again. Maybe they'll die before I see them again. That wrenching away from home. We really do have a lot connecting us, much more than separating. And so when we just focus on Mennonite history and just focus about telling our own history, we sometimes lose those connecting points with people that really strike you.